March 9, 1945, Tokyo. Just past midnight, the city was no longer a city but a furnace. Wooden houses that had stood for centuries caught fire, as if soaked in oil. The sky turned red, glowing like a second sunrise, though the sun was nowhere near the horizon. Air raid sirens wailed, their shrill notes swallowed by the roar of engines above. Hundreds of American B-29 superfortresses flew in disciplined formations, their silhouettes dark crosses against the burning clouds. From their bomb bays, streams of incendiaries poured downward, rattling like iron rain. The bombs cracked open mid-air, scattering magnesium pellets and napalm gel that clung to rooftops, streets, and human skin alike. In moments, entire districts vanished in waves of flame. On the ground, panic spread faster than fire. Families sprinted to rivers, canals, and fields, carrying children wrapped in blankets already singed by sparks. The firestorm sucked oxygen from the streets, creating hurricane winds that ripped doors from hinges and threw bodies like leaves in a gale. People gasped, not from fear alone but from the suffocating heat that filled their lungs with smoke before they could scream. In some alleys, temperatures climbed past 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to melt steel and turn glass into liquid. Wooden beams collapsed as though struck by invisible artillery. For many Japanese civilians, it was not a bombing raid. It was the end of the world. Up above, the American crews saw none of the screams. They saw the inferno as patches of light spreading across Tokyo, each neighborhood blossoming like a fiery flower, merging into a vast sea of flame. Through their plexiglass windows, gunners stared in disbelief at the magnitude of destruction unfolding beneath. Even from 10,000 feet, the heat rose so violently that turbulence shook the planes. Pilots gripped their controls as columns of fire-driven air punched their bombers upward, threatening to tear them apart. Yet the waves kept coming, hundreds of aircraft methodically releasing their loads wave after wave until the city below was unrecognizable. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo had been obliterated. Over 100,000 civilians lay dead, charred or drowned as they sought refuge in rivers turned to boiling cauldrons. It was the single deadliest air raid in human history, more lethal than the atomic strikes that would follow months later. Survivors staggered through the ruins, their faces blank, eyes reflecting the orange haze of smoldering ashes. To the Japanese soldiers stationed nearby, the shock was absolute. They had expected bombs, yes, but not a night when their capital city would simply vanish under a storm of fire. This was not war as they had imagined it. Tanks clashing, infantry charging, samurai-like bravery in the field. This was something else entirely, a war of annihilation from the sky, where a single night could erase centuries of life. Soldiers stood powerless, their rifles useless against the invisible armada in the clouds. Even hardened veterans who had survived the jungles of Guadalcanal or the caves of Saipan whispered among themselves, "How can a nation fight against fire that falls from the heavens?" The raid was not random. It was calculated, engineered, and coldly efficient. American planners had studied Japanese cities with ruthless precision. They knew Tokyo was a tinderbox, its wooden homes clustered tight, its narrow streets forming corridors for firestorms to funnel through. They shifted tactics from high-altitude precision bombing, which had failed against elusive targets, to low-level night raids designed not to destroy factories, but to erase the very fabric of civilian life. The choice was deliberate, and the effect was apocalyptic. For Japanese commanders, the psychological blow was deeper than the physical. The emperor's subjects had been told that the home islands were sacred, untouchable. Now, with one raid, that illusion was shattered. Soldiers on leave returned to find their families gone, their neighborhoods replaced by smoking rubble. Morale cracked, not just among civilians but within the ranks. They could fight Marines on Iwo Jima, resist tanks in Okinawa. But what defense existed against skies filled with B-29s that rained liquid fire? The thought alone gnawed at their resolve. In the stillness after the raid, when ash fell like snow over the ruins, Tokyo's soldiers and citizens alike felt the same silent terror. If the Americans could do this in one night, what would come in the next 100 nights? The war had already turned against Japan, but now it was no longer a question of battles won or lost. It was a question of survival itself. The mystery gripped them. How had the Americans mastered the night? How had they built machines that could fly farther, higher, and carry such immense loads of destruction? To Japanese eyes, the B-29 was not just an airplane. It was a phantom, a technological demon, arriving under cover of darkness to breathe fire upon their homeland. Every soldier who looked skyward in those months carried that dread. For them, the war had become a nightmare from which there was no waking. And so the story begins with fire, with shadows, with a capital city consumed in one night. The soldiers on the ground could not believe what their eyes told them. For in the crucible of the Pacific War, America had unleashed a weapon unlike any before. A weapon not of steel or gunpowder, but of firestorms engineered to erase entire cities. And for Japan, this night was only the beginning. By 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached a point of desperation. Japan's empire, once sprawling across East Asia and the Pacific, was shrinking with every passing month. The thunder of American naval guns had already silenced Japanese bases in the Marianas, the Philippines, and the Central Pacific. One by one, the unsinkable aircraft carriers of Japan's outer defensive ring fell, leaving the home islands exposed for the first time. On the eastern horizon, the United States loomed like a relentless tide, its fleets larger than any in history, its industry churning out weapons at a pace Japan could scarcely imagine. Tokyo knew the situation was grave. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, had been bled dry in battles like Leyte Gulf. The skies over the Pacific no longer belonged to the Zero, but to the Hellcat, the Corsair, and the relentless swarms of American B-29 bombers. On the mainland, the Chinese warfront bled Japan of men and resources, while in Burma and the Philippines exhausted divisions fought delaying battles with dwindling supplies. For every Japanese soldier, the reality was becoming clear. The war was shifting from the empire's expansion to its desperate survival. The United States, by contrast, was flexing the full might of its industrial and technological superiority. Factories in Detroit, Seattle, and California worked around the clock, producing planes, tanks, and ships in numbers that defied comprehension. Where Japan struggled to replace a single battleship, America built fleets of aircraft carriers in months. Where Japan rationed fuel and ammunition, America stockpiled mountains of supplies on remote Pacific atolls. By 1944, the US was not merely fighting a war, it was overwhelming its enemy with resources that seemed endless. The strategic situation was decisive. From the captured islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the U.S. Army Air Forces had gained something unprecedented, bases within striking distance of Tokyo itself. For the first time, the American mainland's industrial heart could project its power directly onto the Japanese capital. The B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber in the world, became the instrument of this new phase. With a range of over 3,000 miles and the ability to carry nearly 20,000 pounds of bombs, it was unlike anything Japan could match. Japan's cities were particularly vulnerable. Unlike the concrete skylines of Europe, Japanese urban centers were built from wood and paper, designed for centuries of tradition rather than modern war. Entire neighborhoods were little more than matchboxes waiting for a spark. Even Japanese leaders understood this fragility. The nation's great metropolises, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, were sprawling, densely packed, and catastrophically flammable. Yet despite these vulnerabilities, Japan clung to the hope that American bombing would remain limited to precision strikes against factories and military targets. For much of 1944, this seemed to hold true. The US initially relied on high-altitude daylight raids, aiming to cripple aircraft plants, steelworks, and arsenals. But the Pacific weather betrayed them. The jet stream, unknown to American planners before the war, disrupted bombing accuracy, scattering bombs miles off course. Japanese defenses, though thin compared to Europe's flak towers and Luftwaffe fighters, still inflicted losses on the B-29s. Weeks of precision raids produced meager results. To Tokyo's soldiers and civilians alike, it seemed that the capital might endure, that American technology had limits. But beneath the surface, a shift was coming. General Curtis LeMay, a man of cold calculation and ruthless efficiency, had studied the failures. He concluded that precision would not end the war. Japan's industry was not confined to factories. It was embedded in homes, workshops, and entire districts of cities. Every family that wove parachutes, assembled weapons, or repaired machinery was part of the war machine, and those war machines were housed in structures of wood and paper. The solution to LeMay was grimly logical: burn the cities to the ground. This was not a strategy the Japanese High Command had anticipated. For years, their doctrine focused on decisive battles, the kind fought with fleets and armies. They had envisioned duels of battleships at sea, or heroic defenses of island fortresses. What they had not prepared for was an enemy that would bypass those battles altogether, striking directly at the heart of the civilian population. To Japanese generals raised in a code of Bushido, it seemed dishonorable, even unthinkable. Yet dishonor mattered little when fire consumed entire districts in hours. By early 1945, Japan's skies were no longer a shield, but an open door. Its air defenses had withered under relentless attrition. Skilled pilots were dead, fuel reserves nearly empty, and factories unable to replace losses fast enough. Radar systems were primitive, anti-aircraft guns scattered and undersupplied. What few fighters remained were often grounded for lack of fuel. When the Americans launched their night raids, the Japanese military could do little more than watch. Soldiers stationed in Tokyo that March night understood the hopelessness. They had rifles, bayonets, swords, but no means to reach the ghosts in the sky. The broader context was even harsher. On Okinawa, Japanese soldiers and civilians braced for invasion as American fleets assembled offshore. On Iwo Jima just weeks earlier, 20,000 Japanese defenders had fought to the last man against overwhelming firepower. The war was closing in from every direction, and yet, when the bombers came for Tokyo, it was not a battlefield but a city that became the front line. Children, mothers, the elderly, none could escape. For the soldiers watching from their posts, the realization was devastating. This war would not be decided by bravery alone. It would be decided by technology, by industry, by fire raining from above. To the Japanese leadership, the shock was a warning of the future. If one night could erase Tokyo, what would 100 nights do? And what weapon awaited beyond incendiaries if America chose to escalate further? Few could yet imagine the mushroom clouds that would later rise over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the seeds of that final devastation were already planted in the flames of March 1945. The stage was set. The world had witnessed bombing campaigns before. London's Blitz, Hamburg's firestorm, Dresden's ruins, but Japan's experience would surpass them all. For the Japanese soldier, the psychological battlefield was now as real as any trench or cave. They had seen the power of America's industry turned into fire. They had felt the helplessness of watching entire cities vanish overnight. And they knew deep down that no matter how fiercely they fought on land or sea, the shadow of the B-29 would haunt every step until the war's bitter end. Night after night, the skies above Japan became a stage for a secret advantage the Americans wielded with ruthless precision. To Japanese soldiers on the ground, it seemed supernatural. How could aircraft of such size and weight travel thousands of miles, strike with devastating accuracy, and return again and again, even through storms and smoke? The answer was not magic. It was an arsenal of hidden advantages born from science, industry, and strategy. At the heart of this superiority was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. It was not just a bomber. It was a leap into the future of aerial warfare. Unlike the lumbering Japanese bombers, the B-29 carried 4 Wright R-3350 engines, each capable of producing over 2,200 horsepower. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to fly at altitudes beyond the reach of most Japanese fighters and flak. To the soldiers watching from the ruins below, it seemed untouchable, an iron leviathan that floated above the firestorms it created. But the true advantage of the B-29 was not just its size or altitude. It was the systems inside. Each bomber carried advanced navigation tools that baffled Japanese observers. The Americans had radar-assisted bombing, devices like the AN/APQ-13 radar system that allowed them to identify cities even through clouds or darkness. Japanese defenders wondered how their enemies always found their targets when the land was cloaked in fog or blackout. The secret lay in electronic eyes that saw through night and weather alike, guiding bomb bays to their prey with chilling certainty. To the defenders, it felt as if their enemies had pierced the veil of nature itself. But hardware alone was not the only hidden edge. The Americans also held mastery of organization and communication. From bases on Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, entire fleets of bombers were coordinated with mathematical precision. Japanese soldiers often marveled at how American formations arrived, as if orchestrated by a single mind. This was no accident. Back in the United States, engineers and logisticians had built a war machine that extended from Detroit's assembly lines to Pacific airfields carved out of coral. Every bomber had spare parts, fuel, ammunition, and crews in abundance. Japan, by contrast, rationed every bullet and drop of fuel. Perhaps the most shocking advantage, however, came from America's embrace of fire itself. Where German cities had been targeted by high explosives, Japan's cities became laboratories of flame. The US tested incendiaries meticulously, combinations of napalm, magnesium, and white phosphorus designed to ignite Japan's wooden homes with terrifying efficiency. On a mock Japanese village built in Utah, engineers studied how flames spread from tatami mats to bamboo beams. They practiced creating firestorms before unleashing them on Tokyo. To Japanese soldiers and civilians, it seemed inconceivable. The enemy had studied their very way of life to learn how best to destroy it. There was also the matter of timing. The Americans had shifted to night raids not merely for cover, but because Japanese defenses collapsed in darkness. Radar was scarce, searchlights too few, and pilots inexperienced in nocturnal combat. To soldiers standing guard, the nights became harbingers of dread. When the distant hum of engines rolled across the sky, they knew resistance was futile. What they did not know was that the Americans had perfected low-altitude approaches, flying at 5,000 to 7,000 feet, to release incendiaries more effectively. It was a tactic born of cold calculation, designed to maximize destruction while minimizing their own losses. For the Japanese High Command, the realization struck like a hammer. They were fighting not just men, but an entire system of innovation and supply that dwarfed their own. Every time a soldier reported the destruction of a district, every time a civilian described fire falling like rain, the same conclusion echoed. America had advantages invisible to the naked eye, not only in planes, but in the science that powered them, the communication networks that guided them, and the relentless logistics that sustained them. On the ground, disbelief turned into resignation. Soldiers tasked with defending Tokyo whispered about the ghost bombers that could not be stopped. Civilians muttered rumors that the Americans had discovered new chemical weapons or unholy machines. In truth, the devastation was the product of ingenuity and scale, not sorcery. Yet for those who lived through the raids, logic mattered little. The emotional impact was the same, an enemy that seemed omnipotent, whose reach extended into every shadowed street of Japan's cities. To Japanese soldiers, this hidden advantage was a cruel irony. They had been trained to fight with courage, to value spirit over material. Yet the war revealed that spirit could not extinguish napalm. Samurai resolve could not swat away a B-29. And as the raids continued, it became clearer that America's strength was not in a single weapon, but in the seamless combination of many. Technology, industry, organization, and fire itself woven into one overwhelming force. By the spring of 1945, the illusion of invulnerability had been burned away. The home islands were no fortress. They were targets. And with every night raid, Japanese soldiers could only watch in disbelief as America's hidden advantages turned their cities into ashes. The B-29 Superfortress was more than a bomber. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a weapon born from America's relentless marriage of science and industry. To understand why Japanese soldiers stared helplessly as cities burned, one must look beneath the silver skin of those giants in the sky, to the machinery and technology that made them unstoppable. Each B-29 stretched over 99 feet in length, with a wingspan of 141 feet, larger than any bomber Japan could field. It was powered by 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone radial engines, each a 2,200 horsepower beast of pistons, cylinders, and roaring combustion. Together, they drove the aircraft at cruising speeds of 220 miles per hour, with top speeds reaching 357. For Japanese fighters like the aging Kai-43 Oscar or Kai-61 Tony, catching a fully loaded B-29 at its operational altitude of over 30,000 feet was nearly impossible. Even when they climbed to intercept, oxygen-starved engines sputtered while the Americans, cocooned in pressurized cabins, breathed comfortably above the clouds. That pressurization was revolutionary. For the first time, Crews could fly high-altitude missions in relative safety, insulated from freezing winds and thin air. Japanese planes, by contrast, forced their pilots into frostbite-inducing cockpits, straining just to keep engines alive in the upper atmosphere. The B-29's climate-controlled compartments symbolized a truth Japan could not ignore. This was war waged not only with courage, but with comfort engineered into machines that could outlast human limits. Then there was the firepower. The B-29 carried 1250 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, mounted in remote-controlled turrets that swiveled with deadly precision. Gunners did not lean out of windows with rifles. They aimed using advanced analog computers that calculated lead, wind, and target speed. Japanese pilots often charged bravely into formation, only to be cut down by invisible arcs of tracer fire guided by mathematics. A lone zero against a squadron of B-29s was not a duel. It was a suicide. But the true terror did not come from the guns, it came from the bomb bays. The superfortress could haul up to 20,000 pounds of explosives. By 1945, this payload increasingly consisted of M69 incendiary bomblets, small canisters filled with napalm gel. Each weighed 6 pounds, and each was designed to shatter mid-air, spraying flaming chemicals across wide swathes of wood and paper. A single B-29 could carry thousands of them. An entire formation meant rivers of fire falling from the night sky. Napalm itself was a grim innovation. Developed at Harvard by chemists led by Louis Fieser, it was a thickened gasoline, sticky and nearly impossible to extinguish. Water spread it, dirt could not smother it, and once ignited it clung to skin and clothing, until flesh itself became fuel. Japanese wooden houses with paper screens and bamboo frames offered no resistance. Engineers had tested this beforehand in Utah, where mock villages were constructed to replicate Japanese homes. The results were horrifyingly predictable. Once napalm touched tatami mats or wooden eaves, fire spread faster than any bucket brigade could stop. Even navigation bore the stamp of innovation. The AN/APQ-13 radar system, fitted into the B-29's belly, allowed bombardiers to locate targets even in total darkness or through dense cloud cover. Japanese observers wondered why American raids always struck so precisely, despite blackouts. The answer lay in those electronic eyes, scanning the earth below, painting ghostly outlines of Tokyo's streets onto glowing screens. To Japanese defenders who lacked radar of their own, it seemed uncanny, even otherworldly. Logistics, too, were a hidden weapon. Every B-29 was part of an intricate supply chain that stretched from Midwestern factories to Pacific airstrips. The engines alone contained more than 350,000 individual parts. Tires were 56 inches high, massive and costly to produce, yet replacements were shipped by the thousands. Fuel tankers crossed oceans escorted by destroyers, ensuring that Tinian's runways never went dry. Japan, by contrast, rationed every gallon of fuel, every bullet, every bolt of steel. For American crews, mechanical failures meant a new part flown in within days. For Japanese crews, breakdowns meant grounding forever. Production numbers told the rest of the story. Between 1943 and 1946, America produced nearly 4,000 B-29s. Japan, crippled by bombing and blockade, managed only a fraction of that number across all its bomber classes. Factories in Wichita and Renton worked day and night, women riveting wings, men machining engine blocks, trains and trucks ferrying components across states. It was not just one bomber the Japanese faced. It was an endless wave, an industrial avalanche that could not be stopped. The crews who manned these machines were trained with equal precision. Navigators mastered celestial charts and radar screens. Pilots drilled in tight formation, flying until dozens of planes moved as one. Ground crews practiced tire changes and engine swaps in record time. The Japanese soldier guarding Tokyo saw only the silver monsters overhead, but behind each was an invisible army of mechanics, chemists, logisticians, and assembly line workers who made the impossible routine. Japanese intelligence reports tried to capture these details, but the scope was too vast. They noted the speed, the altitude, the payloads. They whispered of America's ability to replace losses overnight, while Japan mourned every downed zero as irreplaceable. To soldiers huddled in shelters during raids, the technical numbers mattered little, but the effects were undeniable. Cities that had stood for centuries were gone in hours. In the end, the B-29 was not just a bomber. It was the embodiment of America's hidden advantage, the fusion of science, industry, and willpower into a machine that changed warfare forever. For Japanese soldiers on the ground, watching rivers of fire consume their world, the technical details remained a mystery. But the results, entire neighborhoods, erased in a single raid, were written in smoke against the night sky. September 10, 1945, the smoldering ruins of Tokyo were still visible months after the key. Flames had swept through, but the destruction had not been limited to the capital. Across Japan, city after city bore the scars of the night raids. Among the countless missions, a few stood out as turning points. Battles not fought with rifles and tanks, but with fire and shadows from above. For the Japanese soldiers who bore witness, these nights were etched into memory as the moment they realized the war was unwinnable. The most infamous came on the night of March 9, 1945, when Operation Meeting House unleashed over 279 B-29 bombers against Tokyo. From the moment the first waves arrived, the scale of the attack overwhelmed both defenders and civilians. Japanese soldiers scrambled to anti-aircraft positions, but their shells burst harmlessly in the darkness. Searchlights flickered weakly, failing to find targets before flames engulfed their emplacements. When the incendiaries began to fall, it was no longer a battle but a cataclysm. Entire districts ignited simultaneously. Witnesses recalled seeing rivers boiling, bridges collapsing in waves of heat, and people suffocating as oxygen vanished from the air. By dawn, more than 16 square miles of the city were nothing but charred wasteland. Over 100,000 were dead. More than Hiroshima would suffer months later. Japanese after-action reports conveyed disbelief as much as grief. Officers wrote of winds so hot and furious they seemed alive, of fires spreading faster than any defense could contain. Soldiers reported that the very ground seemed to combust. The city they had sworn to protect had been reduced to ash in a single night. Commanders admitted privately what they could not announce publicly. The defenses had failed utterly, and there was no way to stop a repeat. But Tokyo was not the only example. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe all felt the same wrath. In Nagoya, 4 separate raids between March and May burned vast swaths of the city, crippling aircraft production. Osaka endured over 8,000 tons of bombs, leaving more than 1 million homeless. Kobe, struck on March 17th, lost 1/5 of its population to firestorms. In each case, Japanese soldiers and civilians alike faced not a battle but a disaster beyond imagination. They carried buckets of water, dug fire breaks, manned flak guns, but nothing slowed the infernos. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa raged simultaneously, and soldiers stationed there heard grim rumors from the mainland. They had expected the enemy to strike military targets, arsenals, ports, shipyards. Instead, the Americans targeted the cities themselves, dismantling Japan's capacity to fight by burning its people, its workers, and its homes. Letters from soldiers returning from leave told of families wiped out in a single night. Some units were broken not on the battlefield, but in spirit, as men realized their loved ones had perished under firebombs they could not stop. One of the most chilling examples came on June 1, 1945, when Osaka endured a massive daylight raid. Soldiers stationed in the city described waves of B-29s appearing over the horizon like a storm cloud. Anti-aircraft fire rose to meet them, but the formations pressed on with mechanical precision. Incendiaries fell in sheets, and within hours the city's industrial heart was consumed. Survivors spoke of steel factories melting, and shipyards reduced to twisted skeletons. Soldiers on the ground wrote in their diaries, "We could fight the Marines with bayonets. We could fight the tanks with mines. But we cannot fight the sky." The Americans, meanwhile, measured their victories in numbers. Reports counted the tons of bombs dropped, the square miles destroyed, the percentage of housing eliminated. At Aracourt in Europe, kill ratios had measured tank against tank. Here in Japan, the kill ratios were measured in city blocks and human lives. The figures were staggering. By the summer of 1945, 67 Japanese cities had been struck. 40% of Tokyo was gone, 42% of Osaka, almost half of Kobe. The industrial and urban heart of Japan was being methodically erased. From the perspective of the Japanese army, these raids had a corrosive effect beyond destruction. Command structures faltered, as communications broke down in the chaos. Units assigned to civil defense were often destroyed, alongside the civilians they were meant to protect. Soldiers reported being unable to reach commanders, cut off by walls of flame that isolated districts as completely as rivers or mountains. Coordination, the essence of warfare, dissolved in the smoke. For the civilians, the psychological toll was devastating. Each raid brought not only loss but anticipation of the next. Families dug shallow trenches, but flames leapt across them. They carried charms and prayers, but no spirit could stop napalm. Soldiers, bound by duty to protect, watched helplessly as their own people burned. The shock was not only physical but existential, a realization that their empire, their military, their very way of life could not withstand this storm from the sky. And yet, the raids continued. Night after night, week after week, the B-29s came, relentless and unstoppable. To the Americans, these were missions. To the Japanese, they were apocalypses repeated, until nothing remained. For those on the ground, soldiers, civilians, commanders, the conclusion was inescapable. This was not war as they had known it. This was annihilation, carried out with machines that turned cities into kindling. In the end, each battle was not a clash of armies, but a demonstration of imbalance. On one side, rifles, swords, and dwindling supplies. On the other, technology, industry, and fire. The Japanese soldier who stood in the glow of a burning city understood the truth more clearly than any statistic. The war could not be won, because the enemy had found a way to erase the very ground they defended. The firebombing campaign did more than destroy buildings. It shattered the very spirit of a nation. For the Japanese soldier, the psychological weight of watching his homeland consumed by fire was heavier than any rifle he carried. Warfare, once defined by duels of ships and divisions, had become a nightmare where the battlefield was everywhere, and the enemy struck not face to face but from the unreachable heavens. Strategically, the impact was immediate. Japan's command structure had relied on tight hierarchies, where orders flowed downward from officers and cohesion came from proximity. In the chaos of the fire raids, those structures collapsed. When entire neighborhoods vanished in flames, phone lines were cut, couriers lost, and command posts incinerated. A platoon waiting for orders found itself isolated, unable to communicate, its leaders gone in the inferno. American units, by contrast, thrived on radio communication. Even as flames roared beneath them, bomber crews spoke calmly through headsets, relaying navigation data, target confirmations, and course adjustments. The contrast was stark. American forces moved as one, while Japanese units stood in silence, cut off, bewildered. The psychological blow was perhaps even more devastating than the material one. For centuries, Japan had cultivated a belief in the sacredness of its islands, a conviction that the homeland was protected by both divine favor and the spirit of its people. That illusion crumbled in 1945. When soldiers saw Tokyo, Osaka, or Kobe vanish in a single night, they realized no shrine, no emperor's decree, no spirit could shield them from America's firestorms. What had been faith turned into dread. Civilians mirrored this despair. Entire families perished together, leaving soldiers to dig through rubble for their remains. Survivors were left homeless, wandering in fields of ash. The army, once seen as the nation's shield, became powerless spectators. Soldiers reported being cursed by civilians who begged them to stop the flames. For men who had trained to fight with honor on the battlefield, standing powerless as children burned was a torment that corroded morale from within. American planners understood this effect. General Curtis LeMay admitted openly that the raids were not just about destroying factories, they were about breaking the will of a nation. Each city burned was a message. Resistance was futile, survival impossible. The raids were psychological warfare on a national scale, delivered not by words or propaganda, but by fire visible from 50 miles away. The goal was not simply to defeat the Japanese army, but to hollow out the spirit of Japan itself. The contrast between the two militaries was telling. German soldiers in Europe had at least fought under skies filled with flak towers, jet fighters, and hardened bunkers. Japanese soldiers had no such defenses. Their capital cities were as naked as villages, their skies as undefended as deserts. Facing annihilation without the means to resist was more demoralizing than losing in battle. On Saipan, soldiers had fallen in glorious charges. In Tokyo, they watched their families incinerated, while their rifles sat useless in their hands. Reports from the time reveal this despair. Japanese officers confessed privately that morale was beyond repair. Diaries spoke of sleepless nights, soldiers staring at the sky in terror of the drone of engines. Some wrote of shame. Shame that they could not protect their families. Shame that their oath to the emperor was mocked by their own helplessness. Others spoke of numbness. After so many raids, the sight of burning cities became routine. A horror normalized until soldiers stopped reacting at all. And yet, paradoxically, the raids also hardened some into fanaticism. If the enemy would burn their people alive, then surrender was unthinkable. Soldiers spoke of dying with honor, of taking as many Americans as possible before the inevitable end. Kamikaze attacks surged in those months, driven not only by strategy but by fury. In their minds, if they could not defend the skies, they would sacrifice themselves to wound the enemy. But the desperation of these acts only underscored the hopelessness. For every kamikaze that struck, 10 more B-29s returned the next night undeterred. Strategically, the raids crippled Japan's war machine. Factories embedded in cities ceased to exist. Transportation networks collapsed as rails warped in heat and bridges crumbled. Supply chains fractured beyond repair. The economy that fed the army and navy with weapons, fuel, and rations was dismantled one city at a time. Soldiers at the front received fewer supplies, fewer replacements, fewer orders. The homeland was no longer a base of support, but a wasteland unable to sustain the fight. The psychological gulf between the two sides widened with each mission. American crews felt connected, linked by radios, supported by logistics, reassured by the vast machinery of their nation. Japanese defenders felt alone, cut off, and abandoned. One side saw unity, the other isolation. One side fought with confidence in endless supply, the other with the gnawing certainty of inevitable defeat. And so, by the summer of 1945, Japan's will to fight was fractured. Soldiers still obeyed orders, still fought in Okinawa's caves and on the shores of remote islands. But the truth was inescapable. The fire from the skies had already broken the empire. The raids were not merely tactical strikes, they were instruments of psychological collapse. For every Japanese soldier staring into the night sky, the message was clear. This was not just war. This was annihilation delivered with precision, planned by men who saw cities as targets, civilians as resources, and fire as a weapon of strategy. Spirit could not stop it. Courage could not defy it. The war was no longer about honor. It was about survival, and survival itself was slipping away. The fires of 1945 did more than consume Japan's cities. They rewrote the future of warfare. When the embers of Tokyo cooled and the smoke lifted from Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and 60 other cities, the lesson was etched into history. Industrial power, technology, and the will to use them could outweigh even the fiercest spirit of resistance. For Japanese soldiers who survived those nights, the war had revealed a cruel truth. They had fought with courage, but courage alone could not withstand the machinery of annihilation. The legacy of the American night raids reverberated far beyond the Pacific. In their aftermath, Japanese leaders admitted what had once been unthinkable, that their armies, fleets, and even the emperor's divine aura could not shield the nation from destruction. The strategy had worked. By the time atomic fire fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese High Command already understood that surrender was no longer dishonor, but necessity. The incendiary raids had paved the way for the final act, demonstrating that the home islands could be erased city by city if the war continued. The influence stretched into the Cold War. Military planners studied the raids as a grim blueprint for future conflicts. The Soviet Union, watching closely, built entire doctrines around strategic bombing and city destruction. The United States too refined the concept, shifting from incendiaries to nuclear weapons, but retaining the principle. Break the enemy's will not by defeating his armies, but by annihilating his capacity to fight. The B-29 had shown that wars could be decided not in trenches or beaches, but in skies where technology and coordination ruled. For Japan, the scars lingered. Generations grew up in the shadows of charred ruins, haunted by the memory of nights when the sky rained fire. Soldiers who had once believed themselves defenders of the sacred homeland carried guilt and trauma, knowing they had been powerless to save their people. The very fabric of Japanese society was reshaped by the experience, teaching that modern war would not spare civilians, that industrialized nations could turn entire populations into targets. The raids also revealed a profound lesson about human ingenuity, both its brilliance and its horror. The same minds that crafted radios, engines, and navigation systems had turned them into instruments of destruction on an unimaginable scale. Engineers who once dreamed of advancing flight built machines to erase cities. Chemists who once studied fuel efficiency created napalm, a substance that clung to human skin and burned without mercy. War had forced innovation, but the fruits of that innovation were ash and corpses. Yet within the devastation lay the seeds of modern warfare's evolution. The concept of network-centric warfare, where units are bound together by communication and coordination, found its earliest expression in the B-29 fleets. The Americans had not only built powerful machines, they had built a system that linked every pilot, gunner, navigator, and commander into one synchronized organism. Against such unity, the Japanese soldiers' isolation was stark and fatal. The lesson endured. In war, connection is as decisive as firepower. Veterans who fought in later wars understood this legacy clearly. In Korea, American bombers once again reduced cities to rubble, echoing Tokyo's firestorms. In Vietnam, napalm burned jungles and villages, carrying the same terror first tested over Japan. In the Gulf War of 1991, precision strikes guided by satellites proved that the principle had only advanced. The ability to reach deep into an enemy's homeland, sever its arteries, and shatter its morale without ever meeting its armies in battle. The ghost of the B-29 hovered over every modern air campaign, but perhaps the deepest legacy was moral. For decades after the war, debates raged over whether the firebombing of Japan had been necessary, or whether it had crossed the line from strategy into atrocity. Some argued that by destroying industry embedded in cities, America had shortened the war and saved lives that would have been lost in an invasion. Others saw in the charred corpses of Tokyo's children a haunting symbol of war's inhumanity. The soldiers who had defended those cities knew only the reality. They had been ordered to protect, yet had been powerless against fire from the skies. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, a German commander tried at Nuremberg, once remarked, "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together." The same truth applied to the skies over Japan. The Japanese built brave soldiers, disciplined and loyal, but the Americans built machines, networks, and strategies that worked as one. But that difference turned the tide. It was not the sharpness of the sword that decided the war, but the reach of the flame. In the end, the night raids revealed a universal lesson. Modern war is not won by strength alone, nor by courage, nor even by individual weapons. It is won by the power to connect, to coordinate, to harness every resource of a nation into a single strike. The Japanese soldiers who watched their cities burn could not believe what they saw, but the truth was undeniable. The world had entered a new era, where firepower could erase entire civilizations in a night, and so the fires of Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya still burn in history's memory, not only as tragedies of war but as warnings. In those nights of 1945, humanity glimpsed its own capacity for destruction. The glow on the horizon was more than the light of burning cities. It was the dawn of a new age of warfare, one where the sky itself could decide the fate of nations.